September 28th, 1552. An unimaginable assault took place. A small fortress in Hungary stood firm against the might of the most powerful empire in the world. The Ottoman Empire, with 40,000 elite soldiers and massive cannons capable of obliterating walls in an instant. It seemed certain that Eger would quickly fall. But the unthinkable happened. The fortress did not collapse. Standing upon these walls, there were only two choices: fight for your life or watch the world around you crumble. Every bullet, every explosion carried a single question: could Eger be held? Outside, the thunder of cannons echoed endlessly. Inside, an eerie silence prevailed, broken only by the labored breathing of the soldiers. Every passing moment pressed down with invisible weight. They all understood one truth: if Eger fell, everything would be annihilated. And when the walls were breached, it would not be just a fortress that was lost. An entire civilization would fall with it. And at that very moment, in the shadows, a young man quietly forged weapons, not to attack, but to save lives. They were not grand inventions, only simple tools, yet capable of changing the course of the battle. This is not the story of an ordinary battle. It is a story of people who refused to surrender, of a strategist who could see every weakness, and of a strange invention that could turn the tide. These defenders did not possess overwhelming strength. They had intelligence and determination. So, what was the secret weapon that allowed a small fortress, defended by only a few thousand men, to stand firm against the mighty Ottoman Empire? No one could have imagined it, yet they did. And the story of this battle, one everyone believed would end in defeat, has now become legend. To understand why the Siege of Eger became one of the most unexpected stands in European history, we need to understand how this attack began from the very start. For decades, Hungary had lived under a shadow, the kind that made mothers pull their children closer when they heard hoofbeats on distant roads. A generation earlier, at Mohacs, its army had been shattered so completely that the kingdom never truly recovered. The king died on the battlefield, nobles scattered like leaves, and the land itself split. Fortress after fortress collapsed. Buda, Székesfehérvár, Veszprém, names that had once meant safety, now marked the slow retreat of a nation. Each year, the frontier shrank, and each year, the crescent banners climbed farther north. By early autumn 1552, the Ottoman Empire saw an opportunity too perfect to ignore. North of the broken frontier lay Hungary's precious mining towns, rich with silver, rich enough to pay armies and sustain kingdoms. Standing between the Ottoman army and those mines was a single hilltop fortress guarding the roads like a lonely gatekeeper: Eger. A place so small that many foreign generals barely bothered to pronounce its name. People there understood exactly how fragile their world had become. They had seen refugees dragging carts along the roads, heard whispers of burning towns, and watched distant smoke rising from fortresses that once seemed untouchable. No one in Eger believed they were the center of anything, but they understood this: if their walls ever gave way, everything behind them would lie open and exposed. And far to the south, the machine was already in motion. Two Ottoman commanders, Ahmed Pasha and Ali Pasha, prepared to lead a combined force northward, confirming what everyone in the imperial court already believed: Eger would fall quickly. The Ottoman army did not move like an ordinary army. It moved like a traveling world, Tens of thousands of infantry and cavalry gathered on the plains, while engineers assembled siege works and bronze cannons, some so massive they required entire teams to move. On the thousands of snapping crescent banners, the great Ottoman host began its march north toward Eger, expecting another easy conquest. But inside that small, quiet fortress waited people who had already decided they would not run, no matter what was coming. When the Ottoman army began moving north, villages emptied overnight and roads fell silent. Inside Eger, the nobles understood the situation with unsettling clarity. Reinforcements were unlikely to arrive in time, and retreat would leave the entire region exposed. That decision led to István Dobó, a commander whose reputation was built not on dramatic victories, but on composure and the ability to keep people focused when fear threatened to unravel them. When Dobó arrived, he went straight to work. No speeches, no ceremony. He inspected every corner of the fortress, counting vulnerabilities and matching each one with a plan. Once Dobó began, the fortress changed quickly as masons reinforced walls, blacksmiths produced weapons, and women prepared medical stations, knowing they would soon be needed. Soldiers trained until their movements felt automatic, until they could reload a musket in the dark and shift positions without thinking. Every storage room, every hallway, every tower became part of a larger defensive system. Eger was small, but now it was prepared. As the days passed, scouts reported movements to the south. Slow at first, then closer, then too close to ignore. Late one afternoon, the shape of the approaching army finally revealed itself as a broad, shifting cloud rising from the southern plains. Everyone on the walls stopped what they were doing and simply watched as the dust cloud grew larger, closer, more real. The siege had not yet begun, but it was approaching with the certainty of a tide. By the time the Ottoman army reached the outskirts of Eger, the valley below had transformed into an ocean of organized movement as columns of infantry poured into position and wagons rumbled into neat rows. From the ramparts, the defenders watched with grim recognition. It wasn't chaos, it was precision, the kind only an empire could achieve. Then came the artillery as teams of oxen dragged heavy bronze cannons into place along the slopes, weapons capable of breaking apart stone that had stood for generations. It was during this final stage of preparation that another figure stepped forward. Gergely Bornemissza, a young inventor who looked at gunpowder and saw possibilities rather than danger. He had spent days preparing containers that could be thrown from the walls with devastating effect. Barrels packed with flammable materials and glass spheres filled with explosive powders. In a fortress where numbers were not on their side, its ingenuity might be the only thing that mattered. As darkness settled, the drums of the Ottoman army rolled across the valley. Slow, deep, deliberate. A signal that the siege was no longer approaching, but had arrived. At dawn, the first Ottoman cannon fired across the valley, its impact slamming into the southern wall with a force that shook dust from the rafters and sent stone fragments skidding across the battlements. Moments later, more guns joined in, with a steady, punishing rhythm that hammered the same sections again and again. The defenders responded with their smaller cannons and muskets, but the difference in power was unmistakable. Inside the fortress, runners carried water to the ramparts, while engineers marked cracks and workers shoveled debris, everyone understanding the same truth. The walls could not take this punishment forever. By late morning, Ottoman infantry began advancing across the field under the cannon's cover. shields raised and confident. But halfway up the slope, they collided with something they did not expect. The first barrel from Bornemissa's team rolled down the hill, bouncing awkwardly until it detonated in a burst of flame that lit the slope with sudden fire. Before any order could be restored, another barrel exploded, throwing burning oil across the ground as formations broke and men scattered sideways. Then the clay spheres fell, small, fast, unpredictable, shattering against shields and erupting in sparks, making it impossible for the infantry to predict where to step or how to reform. The advance collapsed into a forced retreat, a rare moment of shock from a force that believed it had already won. For the defenders, that moment was everything, as archers and musketeers poured fire into the disrupted ranks. Yet no one in the fortress mistook this for victory. Cracks continued spreading across the walls, exhaustion set in, and the enemy artillery never stopped firing. The day ended without collapse, and that alone was a victory. The days that followed turned into a grinding test of endurance, as the Ottoman artillery hammered the same weakened sections, and dust hung constantly in the air. By the third day, their forward positions were close enough to launch scaling attempts with tall ladders and iron hooks. The fighting on the walls became immediate and physical, as soldiers shoved ladders back with pulls and used anything that could break momentum: arrows, oil and water, stones. Eger didn't have endless reserves, so every defender counted, and every injury mattered, as fatigue crept into arms and legs long before the cannons stopped. Through all of this, Bornemissza kept working, adapting his weapons to deal with the ladders by creating smaller firepots that could ignite them from within. By the end of the week, the southern wall was on the edge of collapse, with a deep crack large enough for a man to place his arm inside. Everyone sensed the same thing. If the wall broke, the next assault would pour directly into the breach. The Ottomans knew it too and increased the bombardment, shifting their heaviest guns to concentrate fire on that single weakness. On the morning of the 9th day, the cannon fire struck with heavier intent, and late in the morning, the wall finally gave way. A section collapsed inward, opening a jagged gap wide enough for several men to enter at once, and the sound of the fall rolled through the fortress like a warning. The Ottomans moved quickly as infantry surged toward the breach, with standards lifted and drums pounding. This was the push meant to finish the siege. Inside the fortress, defenders rushed to fill the line as soldiers formed tight ranks, and civilians built makeshift barricades, everyone understanding what was at stake. The first wave hit fast as Ottoman infantry stormed the breach, climbing over broken stone while spears and muskets met them at close range in the tight, violent space. Above the breach, Bornemissza prepared his last and most dangerous weapons, lighting fuses in quick succession and dropping firepots directly into the press of bodies. Flashes erupted among the advancing infantry as fire spread through the rubble, but the Ottomans pushed again and again, each wave pressing deeper than the one before. For a moment, it looked as though the defenders might finally break. Then the weather changed as a sudden shifting wind blew thick smoke from the Ottoman artillery back toward their own lines, dropping visibility and spreading confusion. It wasn't a storm or a miracle, just a brief turn of nature that arrived at the exact moment Eger needed it. The defenders seized the chance, surging forward from inside the breach and driving pikes into the disoriented attackers, as Bornemissa's last firepots created barriers of heat that split the Ottoman formation. The momentum shifted as the Ottoman infantry, unable to recover cohesion, retreated downhill while hesitation crept into their ranks. The breach had been opened, yet the fortress had not fallen. That night, the Ottoman camp was quieter than usual, with no new positions being prepared, and even the drums were still. The next morning, the decision was unmistakable. The Ottoman army began to withdraw. Their artillery pulled away first, then infantry units marching south, slowly and without ceremony. Eger did not celebrate, as most defenders were too tired even to speak, many simply sitting along the walls and staring at the emptying field, unsure how to react to the sight of survival. The fortress had not won by strength, but by lasting longer than the enemy expected. When the final columns disappeared beyond the ridge, a heavy silence settled over Eger as the walls stood cracked, homes damaged, and people exhausted. In the years that followed, the Siege of 1552 became more than a military event. It became a symbol, proving that a small garrison could hold when everything suggested it should fall. It showed that ingenuity mattered, that leadership mattered, and that the courage of ordinary people could shape history. Eger did not change the course of the empire, but he changed the course of those who lived behind its walls. And that was enough.